right, good evening, everybody. Oh, that was weak for such a big group. Good evening, everybody. That's what I thought. Well, for those of you that are visiting here tonight, you're very welcome. I'm Pastor Gary. I'm the senior pastor here. And I bet you had a tough time finding the church. No? This church affectionately has the title, The Worst Location in Santee. But we love it out here. We love it out here a lot. So anyway, very glad to have you here. If you got a bulletin, you can look at that yourself. Let me just remind you of one thing really quick. One is that if it gets more crowded or whatever, or you get claustrophobic, there is an overflow room down the hallway there, so you can watch it on the screen. So if you want to avail yourself of that, you certainly can. The bathrooms are at the end of the hallway. That's important to know as well. So that's the facility stuff. And then next Wednesday night's going to be a special night as well. We're going to have a Passover Seder demonstration. So you don't get to eat. I'm so sorry. But if you've never been through the meaning of the original Passover meal, and then its connection to the Last Supper, and then obviously that's why we celebrate communion. Next Wednesday night we'll have a guy named Glenn Landerkin here who'll be sharing about the biblical significance of the Passover and why we celebrate it today as believers. So that's available to you as well. So I'm going to get out of the way now. It is my privilege. We've been very excited about looking forward to tonight. I did have dinner with Dr. Lisle, and I'm pretty sure I wowed him with my intelligence. He was baffled, all right. Not for the right reason, probably, but he was baffled, I can just say. Anyway, we're very privileged, very excited to have Dr. Jason Lisle here tonight. He's the Director of Research at ICR, so please give him a warm welcome.
All right, well, this is a great turnout. Wonderful. Great. Well, it's my pleasure to come before you this evening and talk about how science confirms biblical creation, because we live in an age where the Bible has been attacked and ridiculed, particularly in the book of Genesis, right? That's the book where people say, well, you can't trust the Bible anymore because we know millions of years of evolution. That's the way that life arrived on this planet and so on. Well, that's what people say. And, it's really important for every Christian to be able to give a defense of the faith. And one of the ways in which we can at least begin conversations is by knowing a little bit about the science behind origins. And so that's what I want to talk about this evening. And of course, I'm going to show you that science doesn't confirm the billions of years or the Big Bang or millions of years of evolution. It confirms biblical creation. God really does know how to communicate, and he means what he says in Genesis. I got my PhD at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and where I got my PhD in astrophysics there, and I had the opportunity to talk with a lot of brilliant people, no doubt about that. Most of them believed in evolution, and that sort of surprised me because, well, it didn't surprise me, but it perplexed me because there's all this evidence for creation. I'm going to share this with you this evening. And I'm sure they were perplexed too, because they're looking at me and thinking, well, and not all of them knew I was a creationist. I didn't let on too much about that, but some of them did, and I'm sure they thought, well, that's kind of odd because certainly he's aware of all this evidence, right? So how is it that different people can look at the same universe and come to very different conclusions about how it came to be? And I want to suggest to you that's because we have a different way of looking at things. We have a different worldview. And all of us have this worldview, like a mental lens that we view the world, and through which we view the world. And of course, I'm looking at the universe through the lens of Scripture, because God gives us the correct view of history. And so it's like a corrective lens that makes things snap into focus. My secular colleagues look at exactly the same data, exactly the same evidence I look at, and they draw very different conclusions because they have a different way of thinking, a different worldview. They're thinking in terms of naturalism, that natural law, and of course I believe in natural laws. I think God's responsible for natural laws. We have a lawgiver, that's why we have natural laws. But my secular colleagues take that to an extreme, and they think everything, even the origin of the universe, is explicable by natural laws. And so they tend to think in terms of millions of years of death, suffering, and so on, producing life on earth. I'm looking at the same universe through biblical glasses, and I find that it makes a lot of sense when you understand the Bible's version of history, the true version of history, beginning with a perfect world that God created, and then it became ruined because of Adam's sin, and so on. You can see the major points in biblical history listed there. And it's because of what Adam did that we need a Savior. And so it really is important, even in explaining the gospel message, that we tie it back into a literal genesis, an historical genesis. So I want to cover briefly 3 different fields of science tonight that often come up in origins debates. Fields of genetics, which is how traits are passed on from one organism to the next. We'll deal a little bit with information theory, which maybe you've never heard of that, but it's really interesting, and it really confirms biblical creation. And then we'll talk about geology, earth science, things like rocks and even fossils, paleontology, that sort of thing. And so we're going to start with genetics, which is the study of how traits are passed on from one organism to the next. And so my first question then is, do animals change? Do dogs change? Do dogs change? Yeah, dogs change. What do they change into? Dogs. Okay, very good. Yeah, see? It's not a problem. And now that's not evolution, is it? That's, dogs changing into different, you can get lots of different breeds of dogs today. We know that. And you can, by selectively breeding them, you can get different breeds and so on. Now, that's not evolution because, they started with dogs. They're dogs now. They'll always be dogs. That's not evolution. That's just dogs, right? That's not a problem. And that's what we'd expect given what the Bible teaches in Genesis, because the Bible indicates that God created animals according to their kinds. And that's a phrase that's used 10 times in Genesis 1, after its kind or after their kind, used of the various organisms that God created. He must be serious about that. There's something to this kind concept. And apparently that represents the reproductive limit of an organism, because when God brought the animals to the ark, Noah's ark, it brought 2 of each kind to preserve their kind, and so that's the reproductive limit. It doesn't say animals will reproduce exact clones of themselves. No, God has built into organisms the ability to change a bit. There's a certain amount of variety built into it. And that's not evolution, though, because they remain the same kind, and they always have and they always will be. This is a place, by the way, where evolutionists sometimes misrepresent what it is that creationists teach. They'll say, well, that creationists believe that God made every species back at creation the same as they are today. And that's not true. First of all, the Bible doesn't mention the word species. That's a modern word. It's a man-made classification system. The Bible uses the word kind, the created kind, bara men in the Hebrew. And it's not exactly the same as a species, right? Because, for example, if you look at this chart up here, this misrepresentation, that's not accurate because it doesn't show any change at all. And we do think things have changed since creation, right? I don't believe that God created poodles in the Garden of Eden, right? Because it was a paradise. It was a very good world. And you're not going to have poodles running around in it. So they've changed a bit, haven't they, since creation? And so now, by the way, you can get different species from a common kind. That happens. There's a group of mosquitoes and it goes off and lives in a cave for 100 years, and you bring it back out and it's not able to interbreed with its parent population. And so it's classified as a different species, but they're still mosquitoes. They're still the same kind. So that's not a problem. So you see, the true view of what we believe would be more like an orchard than a straight line like that. We believe that God created certain kinds of organisms, and they have diversified since creation. There are different varieties, but they're all the same basic kinds that were created. And so there's a limited amount of variation, and we'll see genetically that that's built into organisms to be able to do that. And of course, some of those varieties have gone extinct, and others, sometimes a complete kind goes extinct. Sometimes just a certain variety within a kind goes extinct, like mammoths, which are part of the elephant kind. Or they're genuinely related to elephants. They're in the same kind, and yet they're extinct because those particular genes have been eliminated, as we'll see. Now, in the evolutionary view, the kind of diversification that's possible is unlimited. And so you start with something, a single-celled organism, something like bacteria, and then eventually over hundreds of millions of years, billions of years even, it eventually becomes all the different kinds of life on Earth. And so you're related biologically to broccoli in the evolutionary worldview. And you're chuckling at that, but that is what evolutionists believe. I'm not making fun of them. That really is what they believe. And so there really aren't such a thing as separate kinds in the evolutionary view. Everything's really the same kind, right? And so change ought to be unlimited in the evolutionary worldview. Now, to see how this works scientifically, we need to know a little bit about DNA. That's a very long molecule that exists in the cells of your body. It looks something like a twisted ladder, and on the rungs of this ladder are these little nucleotide base pairs, and there's 4 different varieties of those, always indicated by the 4 letters that you see there, the A, C, T, and G. And based on how those letters are arranged, it actually it spells out instructions on how to make certain proteins. It's really rather remarkable. In the same way that you could spell help with Morse code with beads on a rope, likewise, you can spell out all the instructions to make an organism in its DNA. Really remarkable. You could write a book, theoretically, in DNA. Kind of amazing. And that, in fact, is the mechanism that God used to encode the instructions that make you. And the reason that you were a person and not a cabbage is you've got instructions for a person, and a cabbage has instructions for a cabbage, and I'm sure you're grateful for that. By the way, some of those instructions are the same because we use some of the same proteins that are found in a cabbage, which is why it's useful to eat a cabbage, right, and get nutrients from it. That's very important because, some evolutionists will mock and say, well, if God created all these different organisms, why did he put some of the same DNA patterns in them? Because if he didn't, the only thing we would be able to eat is each other, and that would be a problem, right? It's kind of important that there's some similarities there. You have two different sets of DNA. You get one set from dad, you get one set from mom, and it's the combination of these two sets that determine various traits. A section of the DNA that controls a trait is called a gene. And so here it is with blood type, for example. And so if mom has, if you have type A, you can either have the A and the A gene together, A from mom, A from dad, or you can have the A and the O because A is dominant and O is recessive, so A covers up the O. Probably remember doing this in school. I know that was millions of years ago for some of you, but that's okay. Or the only way you can get A and B, right, by having the combination there because they're co-dominant. The only way you can get blood type O is to have the two recessive O alleles, and that's actually very common because the O allele is very common in human DNA. The thing that I find interesting, though, is that from just two parents, you can get a tremendous amount of variety in the children. So, for example, in blood type, if mom has blood type A, and it's the heterozygous A, where the A and the O, and dad has blood type B, and it's the heterozygous with the O and the B, then the children could have any possible blood type. Isn't that interesting? And you can see how that works out because they get one gene from one parent and another gene from another parent, apparently randomly, or at least only God knows why the ones are selected that they are. And so the children can have, for example, blood type O, even though neither parent has blood type O. But the children can still get that. But they still got the information from their parents. That's what I want to drill home. All the information in your DNA you got from your mom and your dad, but you have a unique combination. And for that reason, you have traits. You might have some traits that neither of your parents have, right? Now, I've got brown eyes like my mom. My brother has sort of green eyes like my dad. My sister's eyes are blue. Now, what happened there? I used to tell her she was adopted. She didn't believe me for that. No. But no, it's because the blue gene is recessive, and so she happened to get that particular combination. Here it is with skin color. We basically already all have one skin color, brown, caused by a pigment, melanin. It's just a question of how much of this pigment you have. And so if you're up in the upper left-hand box there, if you have a lot of melanin, you have all the capital letter representing certain genes there. This is simplified, of course, but the basic principles here are true. If you're in that upper left box and you get married to somebody in that upper left box, your kids are going to be in that upper left box because that's the only combination that's available. Only the capital letters are available. If you're in the lower right-hand box, same thing. You get married to somebody in the lower right-hand box, that's the only combination that's possible. But imagine you're in the upper right-hand box there, the kind of the medium gray. If it's the heterozygous combination, big A, big B, little b, and you get married to somebody in that box, kids can have any shade from very, very dark to very, very light. And there are places in the world even today where that happens, certain places in India, for example, where that can happen. We think Adam and Eve probably had a middle brown skin color, right? Because that would account for all the different shades that we see today. And it's the same way with dogs. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about dogs because we can see the tremendous variation that God has built into the dog kind. And you can do that by having this heterozygous genome where you have the big A, big B, little b. In just two dogs, you can build in a tremendous amount of variety. And you can get different breeds of dog much later by the way those genes sort of fall out as a function of time. Now, in the evolutionary view, single-celled microbes, something like bacteria, eventually over millions of years became something like a horse. Okay? That's what they believe. Now, if that's true, well, then, bacteria have some instructions that form their structure and make their proteins, and a horse has certain instructions that make its structure and make its form. A horse has a lot more instructions than bacteria because it's a more complicated critter. And so if bacteria become horses, then information has to get increased, right, in the genome. You have to somehow add brand new instructions to the DNA of these organisms because bacteria do not have instructions to make eyes or legs or a tail or bones. A horse does have those instructions, right? So if horses evolved from bacteria, at some point, brand new instructions had to be added to the DNA of the bacteria. That has to be the case. It's not just that the horse has more DNA, though it does, but it has more information content in its DNA. It's got instructions that the bacteria lacks. And so it seems to me that unless information increases, you can't have molecules to man evolution. You can't have it, right? Because you got to increase the instructions somehow. So the kinds of changes that I as a creationist would expect would be the kinds that God has built in, based on the information God's built into the genome, whereas the evolutionist would expect brand new instructions to be added, and the information has to increase in order for evolution to be true. And by the way, that's not the only thing that would be required to make evolution work. I think there are some other problems with it in terms of irreducible complexity and things like that. But at the very least, if you don't have an increase in information, you don't have evolution, right? Because that's required. It has to be. And that's very interesting because the kinds of processes we observe in nature scientifically are in the opposite direction of evolution. They reduce information or are perhaps neutral, but they don't increase it. They don't add brand new instructions to the DNA. One of those processes is natural selection. You've heard of natural selection. A lot of people think, well, that's evolution. Well, that's not true. Darwin tried to convince people that they were the same because he knew that if you could demonstrate natural selection is true, which it is, he thought by linking it with his idea, he could convince people of evolution. But they're actually the opposite. They're opposites. Here's how it works. With natural selection, suppose you have two dogs, okay? And suppose that they fall in love and get married and they have offspring, okay? And suppose those dogs have a gene for short hair and a gene for long hair, and suppose those genes have a combined effect, so you have dogs with medium length hair, okay? And again, this is simplified, but the basic genetic principles here are true. And so those dogs, when they have offspring, some of the dogs will get the short gene from mom and the short gene from dad, and they'll end up with very short fur, okay? And then some will get the short gene from one parent, the long gene from another, and they'll end up with medium length hair just like their parents. In fact, that would be the most likely combination. 50% of the offspring statistically would end up with that particular combination. And then some of the dogs would get the long gene from dad and the long gene from mom, and they'd end up with very long fur. And so right here you see in one generation a tremendous amount of variation within a kind. Now there's no evolution yet because we started with dogs, we ended up with dogs. Have we gained any new information? No, we started with information for short and long fur, and that's what you end up with, right? It's just expressed differently. Now suppose there's an ice age. Suppose it gets very cold. Well, what's going to happen? Well, the dogs that have the longer fur, they're going to do fine. They're well insulated against that cold. The dogs with the shorter fur, not so much. They're not so comfortable. And so sadly, they die. Yeah. I didn't say natural selection was nice. I just said it was true. It's not nice. Well, now, the dogs that have the longer fur then are going to find other dogs that have longer fur, right? And they're going to reproduce. Now, the dogs that have the shorter and medium length fur are not going to reproduce because they're dead, and dead things don't reproduce so well. But the only ones that survive then are the ones that have the longer fur, right? And so when they have offspring, what kind of offspring are they going to have? They're going to have, well, dogs with longer fur, right? Because you see, the information for the short fur has been lost from the genome of the dogs, at least in that part of the world. And so are these dogs ever going to have short or medium length hair? No, it's gone. That information's gone. So is this evolution? No, because we haven't gained any new instructions, have we? In fact, we've actually lost some information. We've lost the information for short hair. That's gone. It's a great example of natural selection, right? It's a great example of survival of the fittest, but it's a very poor example of evolution because we've started with dogs, we've ended up with dogs, and we've not increased the information. We've actually lost some information. Putting it another way, if there was a heat wave, would the dogs ever go back to having short or medium length fur? No, because that information's gone. They would just go extinct. That would be the end of it. Unless there were dogs from other parts of the world that still had the information for short hair. Now, if we started the experiment over, and so you got all three varieties again, and this time let's make the temperature get very hot. Okay, now what's going to happen? Well, now the dogs that have the longer fur, they don't do so well, but the one has the shorter fur, he survives, right? And so he goes on, and now what's he going to reproduce with? He's going to go on and produce dogs that have the shorter length fur, right? And of course, that's what we find. And so, again, this is a great example of natural selection. It's a great example of survival of the fittest, of adaptation, right? Because the environment got warm and we say the dogs adapted. Not that any individual adapted, it's just the ones that weren't already suited to that environment died. And so but the information has decreased because we started with information for short and long. Now we only have information for short. And so this is not evolution. It's in the opposite direction of evolution. And of course, this is how we account for different dogs in the wild. Lo and behold, dogs start out with lots of heterozygous combinations, and those that end up in the cold environments tend to have the longer fur genes, because if they didn't, they'd die, and those that end up in the hotter environments have the shorter fur genes, because if they didn't, they'd die. And so we can account for the different wild dogs that we find in the world. So how many dogs would you need on Noah's Ark? Just 2. Yeah, just 2, because you can get all those different traits later. You can get the different variety afterwards. And so they get off Noah's Ark, and they spread out from the mountains of Ararat, where Noah's Ark landed, and they carry certain traits with them. And if those traits are not conducive to survival in that particular environment, then the dogs with those traits die and do not pass them on to their offspring. And so lo and behold, we find that dogs in colder climates tend to have longer, thicker fur. Dogs in the hotter climates tend to have the shorter, thinner fur. It makes perfect sense. The dogs die if they don't have the right traits. And if the dog's smart, maybe it goes to the environment that best suits it. That's another possibility as well, at least for dogs. And so this is how we account for the different breeds of, or the different species or different breeds of wild dogs. It's just an example of natural selection and the built-in information that God has put in the dog kind. But my secular colleagues would say, oh, but Dr. Lisle, it's not just natural selection, it's natural selection and mutations. So we got to talk about mutations. A mutation basically is a mistake in the DNA. You can think of it like a typo in your DNA. It's a copying mistake. And suppose you have genes in dogs for 4 normal legs, which all dogs should have that information. That's not variable. All dogs should have proper legs. But there's a mutation that causes some instructions to be garbled, and the dog's legs don't form quite properly. They still form, but they're much shorter than they should be, and so you end up with a dog with short, stubby little legs. Now, if you think about it, a dog like that is not going to do very well in the wild, is he? Because he can't run very fast because on those short, stubby little legs, he can't catch anything. He's more likely to be caught by something himself, right? He's not going to do so well. And so we find that to some extent in nature, mutations tend to be weeded out. Some mutations are immediately fatal, and those are immediately eliminated. But some mutations just make it harder to survive, and organisms with those mutations tend to be eliminated, maybe not completely, depending on how severe the mistake is. But some people like dogs with short, stubby little legs because they can't jump up on you as much, okay? And so people will find the mutations that they like in dogs, and they will take dogs with short, stubby little legs and breed them with other dogs with short, stubby little legs, and end up with lots of dogs with short, stubby little legs, right? And the dog doesn't have to care for itself because it's got a human caretaker. And so he doesn't have to go out and catch food or anything. And so he survives because human beings take care of him and spend millions of dollars at the vet trying to keep the poor thing alive because he's missing some instructions. And that's why domestic breeds of dogs are full of mutations. They really are. Because in the wild, they would just die. But because they have a human caretaker, they're okay. There are dogs that there are mutations that causes a dog's snout not to form properly. A dog's supposed to have a long snout. There's a mutation that causes it to be short, and the lower jaw doesn't close quite right on it. And the skin is designed to fit the longer snout, so it hangs off the side, and it can get infected. And some people think that's cute. And I don't know if the dog really thinks about it that way, though. Maybe, maybe not so much. Well, let's talk about poodles for a moment. They're cute, but they really do have some problems because of mutations that have accumulated in their genome. Poodles will not survive in the wild. You would not find that because they have too many genetic problems. One of the mutations in a poodle, you see, a dog's fur is supposed to grow so long and then it stops and falls out and is replaced, and that regulates a dog's fur growth. But with a poodle, their hair grows forever because there's a mutation that gene is damaged that regulates the hair growth. And so with poodle, it just keeps growing and growing, and you'd end up with a big poof ball if you didn't, cut it from time to time. And so there's no way they could survive in the wild. And of course, they can get into their hair can get in their eyes, and their eyes can get infected, and they go blind. It can get in their ears, and it can cause all kinds of problems. Can even kill them. And so again, you have to really take care of these creatures because they're missing some instructions. They've lost some information. But is this evolution? And I would say hardly. Not at all, because again, evolution is about increasing the information in DNA, and the problem that poodles have is they're missing some instructions. They've lost information, and it causes them some rather severe problems. And so you see, this is how we account for the different breeds of domestic dogs. It's just the different variations of information that God put in the dog kind, and mutations, mistakes that have crept in that some people have liked, and they've concentrated those mutations into the various kinds of domestic dogs. But it's not evolution, is it? Because we haven't gained any brand new instructions, not at all. In fact, we've lost information. We think the dogs on Noah's Ark would have been more like the wolf kind because they have a lot of the heterozygous genome, lots of different potential for variation. But then as you selectively breed those down and you concentrate the mutations, you get down to the poodle, and that's pretty much it. That's kind of the bottom of the line of the dog kind, basically. But you see, this isn't evolution, is it? Because we haven't gained any new information. We've actually lost information, haven't we? We've lost some instructions, and that's why the poodle has the problems that it does. When I'm doing this presentation for children, I'll sometimes say that information in DNA is kind of like jelly beans. Okay, and so the wild kinds of dogs, lots of jelly beans, lots of information. And then through selectively breeding them and so on, you get down to the poodle, and you've got some problems on your hands, okay? He's got sort of just the bare minimum information necessary to keep him alive. So here's something to think about then. Could I ever turn a dog into a cat by mutations in natural selection? No, and you can see why. Because mutations in natural selection is just removing jelly beans. And a cat has different information in its genome. And you can't turn jelly beans into Jolly Ranchers by simply removing jelly beans. It's not going to work. Different information. Now, again, some of the instructions are the same because we use some of the same chemistry. That's understood. But you can't change one basic kind of animal into another by removing information. It's not going to happen. You just get a sort of a degenerated version of the original animal. And so when we see how dogs reproduce, we find, lo and behold, they reproduce dogs. How about that? And you can get lots of different varieties of dogs, to be sure, because of the way that God has encoded the information in their genome. And when we do this kind of stuff, when we do this kind of observation and experimentation, this is observational science. This is the kind of stuff we can test and repeat in the present. And you know what? It confirms biblical creation. It's exactly what we'd expect, given that God made the organisms after their kind. It does not confirm this idea of unlimited upward evolutionary progress, where new instructions, brand new instructions, are added to the genome of an organism. Now, I do need to point out that mutations can be beneficial. Yeah, there are some mutations that can actually, under certain circumstances, can help an organism to survive, but they're still loss mutations. They still lose information and therefore are still in the wrong direction to make evolution happen. You can imagine an island where it's very windy and the insects, as they're they're flying around this little island, they tend to be blown off into the ocean and they die. Then imagine that there's a mutation that causes the wings not to form properly, so the insects can't fly. They're land-bound, and therefore they can't be, or they're less likely to be blown off into the ocean and die. And so they're more likely to survive because they've lost some instructions. And apparently there are islands where that's happened. Or blind fish in caves, where there's some caves where it's dark all the time. And in that circumstance, it's actually better to not have eyes, because your eyes can get, fish, when they bump into something, their eyes can get infected, and that could be a problem. And there are places in the world where there are caves that are totally dark all the time, and the fish don't have eyes, because a mutation has occurred, their eyes don't form properly, and it actually has an advantage in that particular environment. But it's still in the wrong direction, right? They've lost some instructions, and so it's the opposite of evolution. Or antibiotic resistance. You probably heard evolutionists say, well, here we go. Here's a great example of evolution. Bacteria becoming resistant to penicillin. But it's not evolution at all, because it's in the wrong direction. There are a few different ways that this can happen. I'm going to show you one of these. None of them are evolution, though. There's H. pylori, for example, which is a bacterium that causes stomach ulcers. And you can kill this thing by taking an antibiotic. The antibiotic goes in, it's absorbed into the bacterium, and he's got an enzyme in him that's part of his natural makeup that when it interacts with that antibiotic, it will convert it into a poison, and then the poison kills the bacterium, and you feel better. There is a mutated form of H. pylori, which lacks that particular enzyme. He's got a gene damaged, and so he can't produce that enzyme, at least not in very high quantities. And so when the antibiotic goes into him, it just sits there because he lacks the ability to convert it into the poison. And so he's able to survive, but he survives because of less information. He survives because of a downward trend. It's just in that unusual environment it happened to benefit him. And so what happens is then you kill off all the ordinary bacteria, and the only ones that survive are the mutated ones. They reproduce, and you end up with a resistant strain of bacteria. And that's something that hospitals are concerned about because they tend to kill off all the ordinary bacteria with their antibiotics. But of course, the resistant strain, by the way, it's not improved. It's not a new and improved bacterium. It's just under that specific circumstance, it was better able to survive. But in the wild, they don't compete as well with the ordinary bacteria because they are missing some instructions. It doesn't kill them, but they're not able to do quite as well. So that's an example of a beneficial mutation, but it's still the opposite of evolution because they haven't gained any new instructions. They've lost information. It's in the wrong direction to make evolution happen. Dr. Lisle is a PhD biophysicist from Johns Hopkins University, says all point mutations that have been studied on a molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. Isn't that interesting? And he goes on to say that not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. And you say, well, what if they find what if they find one someday? But you see, that's not really going to help because there ought to be thousands of them. In the evolutionary view, we're made up of these information-increasing mutations. And so they ought to be everywhere. And according to him, we find not even one. So if somebody finds one, it's not a big deal. There ought to be thousands. If evolution were true, there should be thousands. People say, but what if a section of DNA gets duplicated? That can happen. There are mutations, duplications, where a section gets copied and repeated. Do you have any new information? If a paragraph in a newspaper gets duplicated accidentally, could you learn anything from the second paragraph that you couldn't learn from the original? There's no new instructions, right? There's no new information there. It's just longer, but there's no new information. And the same thing can happen in DNA. Apparently, there's no process by which you can get brand new information in the DNA. And so you see, when we take a look at genetics and we study things like mutations and the information content, this is good observational science. It's stuff that we can look at in the present, testable, repeatable today. We find that it confirms what we would expect given what the Bible teaches. It does not confirm millions of years of evolution where we'd expect an accumulation of brand new information. Well, we've been talking about information a little bit. There's a whole field of science called information theory that deals with how information is transmitted and so on and where it comes from. And we sort of know what information is. I mean, you pick up a book and it's got information in it. But how do we define it? Well, we found that a good definition of it entails three quantities. I'm simplifying this a little bit for time's sake. But basically, information always involves a code system, a symbolic code system. So when you pick up a book and it's got a word like lion in it, you don't actually see a lion there. You don't see the animal. You see a word that represents the animal. Okay, and so it's symbolic. It's a code system. It always entails language. Most of the books you read are probably English, but there are other languages as well. There are computer languages and all kinds of different languages that have syntax and grammar and rules of that nature. And there's meaning. When you read a book, there's something that you can learn from it. There's an expected action. There's an intended purpose. When you read a cookbook, the expected action is that you'll produce the product that it's describing how to make, and the purpose is so you can eat something, okay? And so that's an example of information. So here's a possible example of information. Could this be information? Well, it could be. It looks like there might be a code system there. It turns out it is information, and the way you can tell is you can decode it. If you decode it and it means something, then you know you've got information, right? And it turns out this is actually Genesis 1 through 5, right? Let's take a look at it here. It says, in the beginning, at a clipboard, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so on. Well, you can read the rest of that there. But you can see it's Genesis told in a sort of a symbolic form, using different symbols than we're normally acquainted with. So really interesting, isn't it? But when you have information like that, and we know this has information because we can decode it, when you have information, certain rules apply, certain laws of nature, just like you have the law of conservation of energy. That applies when you have energy. So there are laws of information. Dr. Werner Gitt, one of the world's experts on information theory, says there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. That appears to be a law of nature, that information never arises spontaneously. And so, if you put a typewriter in a box and just let it sit there or just jumble it around like that randomly, it's not going to produce a work of Shakespeare. It's not going to do it, okay? Despite what students may want, they put their homework in there and just shake it up. It's not going to do it for you. It's not going to produce any new information. We sort of know that. Well, where does information come from? A mind, ultimately. Now, information can be copied, and it doesn't have the process of copying doesn't have to be a mental process, but the source of information is always a mind. And that also appears to be a law of nature. When its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. So what he's saying there is that information can be copied many times. I mean, if you have information in a book, where did that information come from? Probably from a machine that makes lots of books simultaneously, right? Well, where did the machine get its information? From a computer, probably. Where did it get its information? From another computer. You trace it backwards, eventually you'll end up with a mind. Somebody wrote it. If it's creative information, it always goes back to a mind. There are no known exceptions to this. This is a law of nature. Now, that's very interesting because, of course, in DNA, what do we have? Information. Yeah. And it's been copied many times. The information in your DNA, you got it from your parents, and they got it from their parents. It's been copied many times, but ultimately it has to go back to a mind. And see, that makes sense in the creation worldview because information goes back to, all the way back to Adam and Eve, and they got it from God. And the original organisms that God created, they got their information and their DNA from God. The information's been copied many times into our present state, and some of it's been lost due to mutations and natural selection. And we have some little problems from time to time. You have lower back pain or hair loss or whatever it is. That's due to little mistakes that have crept into the human genome. But really, information is not compatible with evolution. And you know, the funny thing is, in their heart of hearts, evolutionists know that information does not come about by chance. They know it always goes back to a mind. And I did a little social experiment to prove this a while back. There was an article that appeared on my blog. I have a blog, jasonlisle.com, and there was an article that appeared on there called On the Origin of Articles by Means of Natural Selection. You get the idea. Okay, and so the article tries to persuade you that articles have no authors, that they are just an accumulation of typos. And you know, most typos make an article worse, but occasionally a typo, you might imagine, might make an article better. And so those are preserved and copied, and eventually articles get longer and better as they're copied over millions of years, right? And that explains why articles use, for example, the same words, like the word "the" is in many different articles. Now, how could that be unless they're biologically related from a common ancestor, right? Anyway, it goes through and tries to persuade you, using all of the tricks that evolutionists use, to persuade you that articles have no authors, but are merely the random chance process guided by typos and natural selection. And the funny thing is, when this appeared on my, see, I can't take credit for writing it because it would defeat the purpose, but when it appeared on my blog, a lot of evolutionists chimed in. I allow people to comment on that. And they said, "We know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle." I said, How do you know? How do you know that I wrote it? Did you see me write it? No? You're taking it on faith? That's not very scientific, is it? Well, we know what? That it's got information in it? See, they can't go that way because DNA has information in it. So if they say information requires a creator, I've got them. And they can't, and yet they couldn't figure out any other way to say it. Well, we know, we've seen other people write art. Yeah, but did you see me write this one? Well, no. Well, then, you know, that's pretty much blind faith. I mean, if you want to believe that way, fine, but keep it in church, man. You'll have to get on there later and look at some of the comments. It was really funny, and it was fun for me to play the part of the evolutionist for a change, because I got to use the same fallacies that they use in defending their position, and none of them could really defend their position without giving up evolution, you see. It's really interesting. SETI is another example of proof that evolutionists really do know that information comes from intelligence. You've heard of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They have these radio dishes pointed out into space, listening for alien signals, alien radio signals. Now, there are lots of radio signals in space, ladies and gentlemen. The sun gives off radio. I can listen to that. It sounds like static, kind of. There are other stars give off radio signals. Galaxies do. There are things called pulsars that give off these little pip, 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 like that, these regular pulses. So with all these radio sources out in space, how would you distinguish an intelligent radio transmission from all of these natural ones? And of course, the folks at SETI would tell you, well, of course, the intelligent signal would have information in it, right? It'll have some kind of meaningful message. Indeed, if we got instructions from space on how to build a warp drive, and we built it and it worked, wow, that would probably that would convince even me that there's probably life out there. I don't think there is life out there, but it would convince me, wouldn't it? Because, hey, information always comes from a mind. And yet you point that in the other direction. You have them look through a microscope at DNA. That didn't come from a mind. That's just random chance. All that information. It's inconsistent. It shows that in their heart of hearts, they really do know God. Well, let's talk about geology now, the study of rocks, and we'll include fossils in this as well. The first misimpression that I have to clear up here, because people think, well, haven't rocks been radiometrically proven to be billions of years old, right? And people have misconceptions about that. They just think it's almost like magic. You know, you take up your rock, you hold your tricorder out, you scan it, and there it is, millions of years old, right? Well, really, it's more complicated than that. I'm going to kind of sum it up here for you briefly. It's again more complicated than this, but basically there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable. We call them, they're said to be radioactive. And what that means is they will spontaneously change into another type of atom. You don't have to, there's no external force necessary. Uranium-238, for example, will spontaneously change into the next atom, which changes into the next one, and so on, all the way down to lead-206. Lead-206 is not radioactive, it's stable. And so once you're lead-206, forever you are lead-206, unless there's some kind of outside force. But fortunately, only a small fraction of atoms are of the radioactive variety, so you don't have to worry about changing into something else within the next 24 hours anyway. Now, the idea is this process, at least for some atoms like uranium, is very, very slow. Atom by atom, one popping into the next, and so on. And so the idea is if you had a chunk of solid uranium and you waited long enough, it would be part uranium and part lead with some of the intermediate elements as well. And eventually it would be all lead. That's the idea. And so you can use that like a clock because the rate is known. And it's thought not to be affected by temperature, at least not very much, or by chemistry and so on. And so it seems like it's a really good clock. And so if you pick up a rock on Earth and it's got some uranium and some lead in it, you could extrapolate backwards and figure out when the rock was all uranium. But how do you know it was all uranium to begin with? Maybe the rock had some lead in it to begin with when it was first created, right? So you'd have to know what it started with, right? Well, how do I know what it started with? Well, you tell me how old you want the rock to be, and I'll tell you what it started with. You see? And by the way, evolutionists do not assume that it started with all uranium. They assume that it had some lead in it to begin with. In a way, it's the same way that you can keep time with an hourglass. Now, I think you can keep time with an hourglass if certain assumptions are met. I mean, if you came in here and I had an hourglass, starting when you first came in here and it looked like that, it looked like it does on the screen with about halfway through, and I say, how long ago did I turn that over? That's easy. It's an hourglass, halfway done, half an hour, right? I say, oh, I got you, because in fact it was sideways when I first came in. Already a lot of the sand was in the bottom chamber. You see, you assumed that all the sand started in the top chamber, which would be like assuming the rock was all uranium to begin with, and that wasn't the case. Or how do you know that somebody didn't come and add sand to the hourglass when you weren't looking, right? That would affect your age estimate. And in fact, in rocks, certain chemicals like uranium are leachable in salt water. They can actually move in and out of the rock. It's possible for that to happen. Or how do you know the throat of the bottle has always been the same size? Even if the throat was wide, it's probably realistic for an hourglass, but we think that the rate at which radioactivity occurs can change. We know it can change under certain circumstances because we can do it. Certain kinds of radioactivity have been accelerated by a factor of 1 billion in laboratories. And so if it can happen in laboratories, it can probably happen outside of laboratories too. So basically, these are some of the assumptions involved in radiometric dating. That the initial conditions are known, that the decay rate is constant. We have very good evidence that number 2 is wrong. And for that reason, the estimated ages of these rocks are going to be very much inflated because they assume that the decay rate's been constant when in fact it hasn't. But regardless of these details, I want you to take home this bottom line. Here's the bottom line. We've tested rocks of known age, and they fail in terms of getting the right radiometric age estimate. Mount St. Helens, for example, when it erupted in 1980, and there were some subsequent eruptions, we took some brand new rocks that had formed from the magma, and that's supposed to set the 0 point for the radiometric clocks. And we sent them in and had them radiometrically dated, which you normally wouldn't do because it's expensive. Why would you test it on a rock of known age, right? Well, because we wanted to check the method. We wanted to see if the method works. And these brand new rocks came back with estimated ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years on brand new rocks. You say, well, that's an isolated incident. It's not. If you go to Hawaii and you take a rock from Hawaii and have it radiometrically dated, a brand new rock, you saw it come out of the volcano, you could stick your pike in it and let it cool right there and send it in, you will get millions of years, pretty consistently. So the bottom line is radiometric dating has been shown to not work on rocks of known age, and yet evolutionists assume it works on rocks of unknown age. Now, to me, that's a lot of blind faith right there. That's not a reasonable faith. We all have faith. That's not a reasonable faith. Because when you test it and it doesn't work in little things, how can you trust it in large things? That's kind of a biblical principle, isn't it? If I gave you a calculator and you put 2 plus 2 equals, and it gave you 67,521. And I said, well, don't worry, it works on big numbers. So I don't think I trust that. I don't think I would trust it with big numbers. What about carbon dating? Now, carbon dating is a little better because we think the acceleration of the radioactive decay didn't affect carbon as much. But people have heard of carbon dating. They think it gives billions of years. It doesn't, nor could it, because C14 decays very quickly. I'll come back to that. But carbon dating is one type of this radiometric dating. But with carbon dating, it tends to give the right answer. And when we test it on things of known age, it tends to give reasonable answers. Now, it's not infallible either, but it tends to give answers that are consistent with what we'd expect when tested on things of known age. And the idea with carbon dating is there's a certain variety of carbon. Most carbon is C12. There's a certain variety of it that's C14. It's got 2 extra neutrons, and it's radioactive. C12 is stable. C14, radioactive. And a small fraction of that is in the atmosphere that we're breathing right now. It's in the food that you eat. It's incorporated into your body. So a small fraction of you is C14. So you're all slightly unstable. How about that? You knew that, though, right? And while you're alive, I mean, that C14 is constantly decaying into nitrogen, but when you're alive, you're replacing it because you're eating new food, you're breathing air, and so on. You're exchanging carbon with your environment, and so you replenish it. But when you die, it simply decays away. And so the idea is by measuring the C14 to C12 in something, you can tell how long ago it died. And we find that it tends to give the right answer. And the interesting thing is it gives the right answer that creationists would expect, even on things that evolutionists believe to be millions of years old, like coal beds. You can take a chunk of coal, it'll have C14 in it. Every time. You won't find an exception to that. And yet if if the entire Earth were nothing but C14, after 1 million years, you would not have a single atom left. That's how quickly it decays. And yet they find it in coal beds that they think are hundreds of millions of years old. Can't be that old. The C14 would be gone. We've even found C14 in diamonds. Diamonds that evolutionists believe to be 1 to 2 billion years old based on these other radiometric methods. And yet there's C14 in them. They can't be that old. They can't be more than a few thousand years old. Isn't that interesting? And they say, well, there must be some kind of contamination. How? It's a diamond. It's the hardest substance. How are you going to get new C14 in there? Does it make any sense? We've even carbon dated dinosaur fossils. You know, sometimes with fossils, if there's enough carbon left, you can actually carbon date them. And every one that we've tested has C14 in it. They're all thousands of years old. Not one of them is dated millions of years old by carbon dating. Lots of things like that. You tend not to hear about these in the secular school system, sadly. But there are all kinds of physical processes that limit the age of the Earth to much less than the billions of years that most people are taught. The rate, for example, at which salt goes into the ocean. You know, even freshwater rivers have a little bit of salt in them. They pick it up from the continents. They dump it into the ocean. The water evaporates, but it leaves the salt. And so oceans are consistently getting saltier and saltier. You can get rid of a little bit of the salt with salt sprays and things like that. But essentially 450 million tons of new salt enters the ocean every year. The oceans are getting saltier. Now, you can work the math backwards. And you know, even being very generous to the critics and assuming the slowest possible conditions, the oceans can't be more than 62 million years old, because at that point, that's an upper limit, right? Because you can't have less salt than no salt. So that's assuming they had none to begin with. Obviously, if the oceans started salty, then they're much younger than that. So that's a problem, though, for the secularists, because they believe the oceans are 3 billion years old, but they can't even be anywhere close to that. On the other hand, it's perfectly compatible with 6,000 years because it's an upper limit. 62 million as an upper limit would include 6,000 years as a medium or lower limit, and then the secular age is way off. Likewise, for the accumulation of mud on the ocean floor. You measure the amount of mud that's there, you measure the rate at which it accumulates, you find it takes less than 12 million years at present rates. And that assumes there was no worldwide flood, which would dump mud on the ocean floor very quickly. And so that's consistent with the biblical time scale, but it's not consistent with the billions of years. Lots of things like that. Human population. How long does it take to get Earth's current population of human beings from just 2? It doesn't take anywhere close to millions of years. Not anywhere close. It takes a few thousand years, something like 4,000 years, because the human race had to start over with Noah and his family. So it's very consistent with that. World population growth, we've been able to measure that to some extent over the centuries. The best evidence, though, that the world's thousands of years old, not millions or billions, because all of these are circumstantial. They're good, but they're circumstantial. We only have one that's definitive. we have the testimony of the one who created the heavens and the earth. And he tells us when he made it. He tells us he made it in 6 days, and he tells us from those genealogies you love to read before you go to bed, and so begets so-and-so. You add up those ages, and you find it was a few thousand years ago that God created the heaven and earth and all that's in them. And that's very clear. The science lines up with it, but the Bible's very clear. So the secular scientists say the earth's billions of years old, take my word for it. God says I created in 6 days, take my word for it. And by the way, it's not because of the evidence that evolutionists believe in millions of years. It isn't, because we've seen the evidence really is very consistent with biblical creation. They have a philosophy that drives them to interpret the evidence that way. Now, we all have a philosophy. We all interpret the evidence in light of our philosophy. It's just mine works. Mine is self-consistent because I base mine on Scripture. What about fossils? I was sort of given the impression that fossils take millions of years to form. Well, here you have a fossil ichthyosaur, a marine reptile now thought to be extinct. And this thing was fossilized, killed, and buried and fossilized in the process of giving birth. You see the baby ichthyosaur being born there? They were born tail first because they had to swim to the surface to get their first breath of air. As air breathers, really fascinating. You have there a fish fossilized in the process of eating another fish. So again, I don't think that's taken millions of years. Obviously, the thing was killed and buried quickly at least, and then it must have fossilized relatively quickly. You can even see some of the stomach contents from the ichthyosaur. See, people think that, something dies and it just slowly fossilizes. Most things don't fossilize at all. And we sort of know that from experience, right? I've been picking on dogs. Let's pick on cats now, okay? Let's suppose that we're going to do a little experiment here on our dead cat, Earl. And day 1, dead cat on grass. And we got the sign there, so nobody's going to touch it, all right? Day 3, wait a little while. Now you got a smelly dead cat on the grass. Day 9, very smelly dead cat on the grass. Day 20, parts of Earl missing. Day 38, more of Earl missing. Day 65, Earl's missing. Yes, okay. Things don't just slowly fossilize over millions of years when they're exposed to the environment like that. They decay. They're recycled back into the environment. They're picked off by scavengers and what have you. Things don't just slowly fossilize over millions of years. You have to bury something to get it to fossilize, really, to protect it. You have to do something to protect it, and burying is usually the way to go. But even there, I was given the wrong impression. I was told that the fish dies, it sinks down to the bottom, it's slowly covered with sediment over millions of years. But you see, if this layer was deposited, or this layer was deposited millions of years after that layer, the top of the fish would have decayed already. The whole thing has to be buried pretty quick. Fish tend to float anyway, right? Or they're picked off by scavengers, and they don't just sink to the bottom and wait to be fossilized. It doesn't happen. Now, if you really want to form a fossil fish, here's how you do it. You go home to your aquarium, and you dump some concrete on your fish. There you go. That's going to kill him. It's going to bury him, and he's going to fossilize. All right, as long as the minerals moving through there are right, he will permineralize. That's what a fossil is. It's the minerals moving through and filling in all the little holes in the bone. Usually the flesh has time to decay away, but the bone gets permineralized. And so that's how you make a fossil. It doesn't take long times. It just takes the right conditions. And we can fossilize things quickly in a laboratory. It doesn't take a long time. What about the types of fossils we find? We find fossils of fish and horses and people and so on, but we don't find one kind changing into another. And so when you see things like this in the textbook, the evolution of the horse, and you say, boy, there are a lot of different varieties of horse there, right? That's what I'd expect in the creation view. Now, they can line them up, right? But you can line up a fork and a spork and a spoon. But that doesn't mean that one changed into the other, right? I mean, just because there's a sequence doesn't mean it's an evolutionary sequence. These are just different varieties of horse. And the number of ribs is different, and the feet are a little different. And you say, oh, yeah, but one of them is really big and one of them is really small. So what? We have different breeds of horse today. These are both adult horses. They're just different breeds. A lot of variation within a kind. That's exactly what I'd expect given biblical creation. The kinds of fossils that we find are exactly what we'd expect given the variation within the kind that the Bible teaches. What about the rocks in which these fossils are found? Don't rocks take millions of years to form? Not at all. Here's a set of car keys embedded inside solid rock. I don't think that took millions of years to form. Unless cars go back a lot more than I think they do. Here's a man-made clock embedded inside solid rock. How about that? I don't think that took millions of years. Well, surely all these layers of rock shown here took millions of years. There's a person down there at the bottom for scale. See that? Those layers did not exist before 1980. Those were all produced in the Mount St. Helens eruptions. Isn't that interesting? And they're solid rock now. They were formed by a pyroclastic flow that came out of that volcano. And Mount St. Helens was a small volcano by volcano standards, really. The Bible says that during the great flood, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That might indicate all the volcanoes on earth going off, something like that. So, and it carved out again, the Mount St. Helens eruption carved out a canyon 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon. It did this in days. It doesn't take millions of years for these things to happen. It happens quickly under the right circumstances. So you see, when we take a look at geology and we see how these rock layers form today, and we see how they can form under catastrophic conditions, we find that it's really very consistent with what we'd expect from Genesis. What do the rocks really mean? They don't really indicate millions of years of evolution. What they really teach us is repent. They tell us that God judges sin. That's what all these fossils indicate. They indicate that there was a worldwide flood. And that was made necessary because God is a righteous God, and he judges sin. He is just. He is righteous. He's also merciful, and he provided the way of escape. And that was what the ark was all about, right? The ark was the way of escape. Noah was a preacher of righteousness. I'm sure he was preaching, come on board the ark and be saved. And yet only a very few people, only his own family, heeded that call. And I think it's interesting, too, that God was the one that closed the door. God was the one that decided time of mercy over time of judgment now. And that opportunity is slim for everyone because God gives us so many years to receive him, to repent of our sin and receive him, and then that door closes. Well, it's so important to learn about this stuff because this will come up. In conversations with people, people will ask about Genesis and can you really defend it and so on. And so for that reason, we have lots of wonderful resources that I encourage you to check out on the tables out there. One that covers just everything I covered today and a lot that I didn't have time to cover. Creation Basics and Beyond. This is a great resource written by all of our staff scientists at ICR. It's very readable, and yet it's rigorously defended, so it's referenced and everything, so you can really defend it well. Ultimate proof of creation. If you want one argument, you say, I'm not a scientist, I just want one argument that really blows them all away. This is it. Okay, this is going to show you how to think and defend the Christian faith the way Jesus did in his earthly ministry. And Jesus was very good at defending the Christian faith in his earthly ministry. And you can learn to do it that way too. And this book's going to train you in how to think and how to show people that Christianity is the only rational option. Anything else reduces to absurdity. Discerning truth, how to spot errors in reasoning that evolutionists make. And I don't mean to belittle them, but evolutionists do make a lot of mistakes in reasoning. They really do. And for their own benefit, we need to gently point that out. And you say, well, that's an equivocation fallacy there. You've changed the meaning of the word evolution within the argument. Or that's a reification fallacy when you say nature guides or whatever, things like that. And point out these are errors in reasoning. They need to become a little more self-conscious of these things. Taking Back Astronomy, that's my basic book on how to enjoy the universe and how to show people how the universe declares God's glory and not a big bang in billions of years. It'd be a great book to read and then share it with your friends. We have DVDs as well. We have Created Cosmos, takes you on a tour of the solar system and out into the universe, and really amazing thing. This is the creation, the planetarium show I wrote for the Creation Museum in Kentucky, and it's really a great DVD. I really enjoyed a lot. The Secret Code of Creation is going to show you how God has built beauty into numbers. This is mind-blowing, and I don't want to give too much away because, as you can see, it's a secret code, right? So I don't want to give too much away there. But it's a secret you'll want to share with everyone after you see it. At least I hope you will. Please sign up for Acts and Facts magazine. How many of you are already getting Acts and Facts magazine? Okay, just a few. The rest of you need to repent of that sin and sign up. Yeah, this is a free magazine, by the way, and it's a great magazine. It's a monthly resource that I'd encourage you to get, and you can sign up for that out front. And check us out on the web as well, icr.org, and I will stick around to answer questions if you have any. So thank you very much for having me out to speak. Really appreciate it.